I wish this kind of debate could be taken into schools to the first generation of voters. More often than not, the younger ones have the opinions of their parents forced on them, and again, the biased media, whereas they don't have the opportunity necessarily to openly debate it with all sides of the argument being available to them. So I don't know whether yourself and ourselves, I know schools is one of the hardest environments to get into, to actually teach them, because they'd rather program the kids than teach them anything. But as part of their citizenship program, could it be incorporated in schools? Could you as MPs take it into
political organising?
Yeah.
I'd be completely in favour of that. I think one of the things we stand for would actually be to lower the voting age to 16 to allow more participation. And where that has been introduced in Scotland in the referendum actually on Scottish independence, the young people were absolutely keen to get involved. It was the first chance ever to have a real say. And yes, I think citizenship, not as it's taught in schools at the moment, because it becomes... I used to be a teacher actually before working in the NHS as I do now. I taught for 5 years before just finding it a very difficult and stressful job, to be honest, with the amount of bureaucracy and all that. That's a different topic for another day, I think. But yes, to give people a real education in politics and actually make them feel part of society and able to contribute to society, and realise it's not just about what other people do. It's not just about some suits in Westminster, that it affects their lives and that they need to get involved. And it's not surprising, I think, that so few young people actually bother voting, is it? Because they don't feel part of their life. If I was a child watching debates in the Houses of Parliament, I would be so confused. A bunch of juveniles, it looks like. And that's their almost first point of contact with politics. And I think it's outrageous.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I agree with everything that Andrew said, but I've just had two other things. I'm a school governor in Barwood, a primary school, and one of the things that all schools are now having to put forward is this notion of British values. And I went along to governor training on these British values, and I think by the end of it, the poor guy taking it had probably wished that I hadn't turned up, because I left with a number of concerns about that whole agenda. Not that I disagreed with the idea of promoting democracy and liberty, rule of law and respect for people's space. No problem with that at all, quite right. But it seemed so narrow. And it seemed to me, and I even made the point at this training, tried not to be too party political at governor training, but I made the point there that it seemed that what the government were trying to do was to create a generation of young conservatives, and that actually, I made the point of where is the great British tradition of dissent, of dissenting voices? Where in these British values is there anything about community or society? Because you know what, Mrs. Thatcher, there is such a thing as society. Where are all of these other? Where's the cultural element? And so I think. Not that I've got a problem with the British values that they've set out for schools to have to teach, but that it is so narrow, and I think it's deliberately narrow, and I think that's a great problem. And so what I tried to suggest, I had a meeting at the school where I'm a governor following this training, set out my concerns, and what we've tried to do is to say that yes, of course we'll teach what we have to teach, but beyond that, the school where I am a governor has a saying that a school that cares, and as part of that we're going to try and teach these broader themes as well, because actually in my view we want to produce rounded citizens, not just a bunch of little people who think that we should doff our cap to the Queen and just live very safe lives that don't have any kind of varied nature within them. And just one other quick thing, I'm a big campaigner on trying to protect youth services, out of school youth services, which have just been, as many of you might know, absolutely demolished up and down the country. I was just hearing yesterday that Newcastle City Council have just proposed a 22% cut to its youth services, and this is happening all over the country, including here in Leicestershire. And I proposed a motion to my party's recent annual conference in Bournemouth in September, and so our policy now, and you might say for what it's worth, because we're obviously no longer in any position to enact it, but our policy now is that these youth services should be placed on a statutory footing, and that local councils should stop seeing, as you rightly say, young people as the first ones to kick when they face budget problems. So all we can now do is call on the government to act, but I hope they will on this. It's disgraceful. And you know, just one very final point. You're right, Andrew, in saying that government do this to young people. Why don't they kind of do the same to older people? It's because older people are a large voting bloc, and I'm sure I said this last year as well. Until young people become a big enough voting bloc, whether it's 16 as I think it should be, or 18 as it presently is, then governments, I'm afraid, of all stripes in one way or another, will continue to punish them.
It's almost a precursor. If anybody speaks out, if anybody speaks out at the moment against the Israeli government, the Zionist government, they're called anti-Semitic. They almost have that stick ready to beat you back. And in America, if you challenge the system, you're unpatriotic. And it's almost as if they're creating this, what is British values, and as soon as you speak out against it, they're going to have a stick ready to label you as being un-British, or whatever phrase they're going to decide to use against you. And it seems like that's the path we're going. It's easier for them to then try to demonise us if we don't agree with what they're laying out as what should be British values.
Right. I think that's true, and I think there's definitely by this government and maybe by successive governments, an apparent need to want to demonise the other, whatever the other is. And at the moment it seems that the other is pretty much always immigrants or people seeking asylum, as Andrew says. But you know, the reason why I think they do this, and call me cynical, but I'm afraid I've been in politics for too long, I think it's because if governments can, if governments, and this tend to happen more with right-wing governments, but not solely, that if governments can demonise the other, then people are worried, more concerned about that family down the street who doesn't look quite like them and who sound quite like them, than they are about actually focusing on what the government is doing in its policy making. And so, you know, if they can get you to focus on whatever else and not concentrate on them, then from their point of view, they've done their job. But I think really that's an affront to democracy. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said. I'd also add, I think that it sounds quite pessimistic what we're saying, doesn't it? That all the direction of things are going. But I do think, though, that time and time again, working class people have always shown a willingness to fight for their rights. In Britain, if you go back, there was the Chartists, for example, who stood up, got some huge petitions and lobbied Parliament and actually showed the power of public opinion. And people, you know, politicians are elected by people. We still have the right to remove them. We still have the right, even if the right to strike goes, there can be wildcat strikes, there can be walkouts. There has always been a rich tradition of dissent in this country, as Matthew was saying. And we can draw on that. In America even, where socialism and left wing have been pilloried for years and years, recently we've just had the re-election of a socialist councillor in Seattle with 90,000 votes. The first time she was elected was the first time that socialists have been elected for 100 years. And she'd won the right for people to have a $15 an hour minimum wage in that city. And that's because of the Occupy movement and because trade unions were demanding decent wages for their members. And that's so I'm not that pessimistic in this, because the harder they beat us with a stick, the more determined is our resolve to actually fight back in some ways. And although things are bad at the moment, and from the point of view of human rights getting worse, then I hope that this will kindle some passion and determination in people. One of the problems is, and this is why I think events like this are so important, is a lot of people, this isn't being heard in the mainstream media at all. You don't see this being debated on Newsnight or Question Time or anything like that. And so small events, even if it's just a few people around the room today, tell people about it, take some posters, take some material and tell people about threats to our human rights.